Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness, and Donovon Jenson is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hi everyone, how's it going?
Hey.
So today on Happy Talks, we are going to be talking about self-esteem and what that means to us and what we can do about it. So Donovan, what are your thoughts about what we can do to improve our self-esteem, or just your thoughts about self-esteem in general?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about self-esteem is kind of just the range, I guess, across like ways that people identify it, right? So some people look at self-esteem as like, wow, this person is super confident and can go in and get anything done, or this person has self-esteem because they like super highly value themselves. So I think for me, the first step here is kind of figuring out a definition, or at least the way that I'm going to be talking about it. So to me, self-esteem is basically the way that you feel about yourself, as well as how that comes to be presented, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily matter a ton how much esteem other people think you have, but it can be important for certain things like making an impression, or like business meetings, or whatever types of things where it's important that people don't think that you have super low self-esteem, because you may just be communicating less value than you actually have or even feel. So when it comes to self-esteem and kind of the ways to work on it, there are a lot of different strategies, but I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is you have to start with a baseline of thinking that you are a worthy and valuable individual. And that's not always the easiest thing for people to start with, right? Like, that's the first step. And that is something that has a lot of problems for a lot of people based on their history. From there, however, and we can go into that a little bit more too, but from there, once you have that baseline of value, then you can kind of do things like review like accomplishments, right? Like, see things you've done, or remember kind acts you've done, or just these various things that prove out that sort of value to yourself. You can do a lot of exercises like that to build even further. But again, sometimes getting that first piece of believing that you have inherent value, sometimes that takes some work. So those are some random scattered initial thoughts. What are you thinking?
Well, yeah, that actually got me thinking about how I've developed my confidence and self-esteem over the years, and that I think when we're kids or little kids, we don't really think about it too much. We're just like happy little kids, going about our day, not caring what we wear or what our hair looks like. None of that. It doesn't just occur to us. And then I think over time, when kids start to tease you or bully you, that kind of has an impact on your self-esteem. And then you start to feel self-conscious, and then you feel like you're not good enough. And that kind of accumulates over our childhood and our adulthood. And I think it does take some work and effort to be conscious of, kids are kids, and to not let it mean that I'm not good enough or I'm not worthy because of some things a mean kid said a few times.
I think that kind of ripples on too, in terms of, if you don't figure out some of the tools that you need to manage some of those external opinions coming in early, then it, like you're saying, compounds, and it follows you as you go out throughout life, and you take these little comments and internalize them and allow those to dictate a huge amount of your self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the more ideal version is basically you dictate your esteem, and then you deal with those comments as they come in, and you internalize them at a rate that you want to, as opposed to just saying, here's the stuff coming in, I just must accept it, and I think it goes back to something we've talked about a little bit before, but the relationship of the people and the kinds of interactions you have kind of matter a lot too, because if your mom or something says, you shouldn't study this thing, you'll never be able to be a physicist or whatever, then that might have more weight than some random person saying that. And it's all about how much you internalize these kinds of different comments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there could be moments in our child, especially our parents have a big influence on us, obviously. And there could have been moments where, maybe mom or dad was really tired and exhausted and wasn't really paying attention to you. Not that they were a bad parent, but they were exhausted from whatever they were dealing with in life. And then, you show them like a really great painting that you're excited to show them, and they're like, whatever. And then maybe in your little kid brain, you're thinking, oh, I'm not good enough. This is never going to be good. My parents don't like me, whatever. And that just kind of impacts, my opinion about it. I think to some degree, every person has some level of that not good enough has occurred to them at some point in their lifetime where, in high school, I got really good grades, mostly A's, a few B's in here and there. And I remember one year, because trying to think of how many people were in my class, because it was a big high school. I think at least a few hundred people in my class year. And I think I was like, one year, not every year, but one year, I remember I ranked like 8th out of that. And I was like, wow, that's pretty awesome. And then I went to med school and I was like really, really struggling because I'm in school with all these super, super smart people. And I always felt inferior and insufficient to perform because I felt like I studied way, way longer and harder sometimes. And still, other people who studied a few hours did better on tests than I did. So I always felt like I'm not smart, I'm not good enough. All of that kind of got warped in my brain just because of like the environment that I was in. And it's not that I'm not smart, but when you're around a bunch of super smart people, then it changes your perception of yourself.
Yeah, when you're used to being at a certain percentile in a group, and then you move to a group made of people out of that percentile, then then the whole structure shifts. And that actually made me think of something that I think is interesting, where I think it's very common to tie, like you were saying, some sort of ability to achieve or like outcomes to personal value.
Yeah.
Whereas, let's say that hypothetically, genuinely, you were not able to make it through med school. Like for whatever reason, you didn't have the skills, whatever else. No matter how much you studied, it just wasn't going to work. Even then, like in an ideal situation, we'd be able to remove kind of this outcome from our actual esteem, right? Our actual value. And I think that's a very, very common thing that people do, is tie those two things together, so that if I can't achieve X, then I'm not, like you're saying, like enough, like a good person or whatever, these other kind of value judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we can get away from that a little bit, and again, it goes back to what I was saying about like having an inherent baseline of believing that you're a valuable individual, then that helps like separate those things out. But I think that is probably the most common thing, is people do not achieve in one realm and then tie that to how they feel about themselves, and then that just spirals downward.
Right. And they're constantly comparing themselves to other people who maybe are performing or achieving more than they are, and then they're feeling inferior. But if you look at it, even the billionaires in the world, they're like, oh well, I'm not Jeff Bezos, so I could still keep still going. I don't know what a billionaire would think, but just there's always like someone that's up in you, and so you want to just continue to go. But then if you're always thinking, oh, what I'm doing right now is never good enough, then that's dictating all your actions, versus being like, I want this for me and my well-being.
Yeah, and I also think it's important too to pay attention to the realms that we're caring about, right? Because if you just switch realms, like put anyone in a situation and then switch realms on them enough times, and absolutely there's going to be something that you're not good at. There's going to be things that even if you really want to, you will not necessarily be able to achieve. Now, that's not the same as saying like you shouldn't try and just give up on everything.
Yeah.
But there will be things, there will be walls that we hit, there will be boundaries. So if we set our esteem and value ourselves as people based on our ability to achieve only, And that means we're guaranteed at some point to run into some sort of barrier. And then that puts our esteem kind of at risk.
Right. No, I agree, definitely. Yeah. The other thought that just came to my mind was thinking about how this one part in a book I read, the book is called Mastery of Love. And the idea is about first and foremost having love and compassion for yourself. And there was one thing that the author had said is that our ability to tolerate abuse is dependent on our ability to tolerate abuse from ourselves in a way. So meaning if you were in an abusive relationship, if that person were to like pass the threshold of how bad you, like, we have so many negative thoughts about ourselves all the time. And if that were to surpass it, then that would most likely push you to like break it off. But if it's just under that, then you maybe would stick around in that unhealthy relationship. But it's like our degree of what like abuse we give ourselves really makes a difference on, you know, how much we receive from others.
So basically the idea is we have our own ideas of ourselves, or like this kind of model that we build of ourselves, of like our value and how we should be treated. And that's how we treat ourselves. And then the idea is we use that model as a baseline for how we expect other people to treat us. So if we have a model that says, oh, like, I'm not a good person, I should be treated poorly, and you treat yourself poorly, then that also maps onto how the kinds of actions that you're willing to accept from others. And then if it gets past that model or is outside of that model, like, okay, I'm a kind of not good person, but you're treating me like a really terrible person, that's when some other action happens. There's some sort of like pushback.
Right, definitely. To illustrate the point a little further is when I was dating in my 20s, I had this whole series of short-term relationships that would last 1 to 3 months. And I wanted a long-term serious relationship, and I couldn't figure out why they kept ending. Why did they keep dumping me when they seemed really interested in the beginning? And I did a lot of personal development work, a lot of therapy, a lot of various things, books, meditation retreats, to really do the personal growth and development to discover that, yeah, I was always kind of putting it on the guys, that I'm like, oh, well, I somehow date these emotionally unavailable men and they don't know how to commit and all these things, and I don't know why I keep going for that. And I realized it just really came more from me, and that on some subconscious level that I have this story that I'm not good enough. I let them, you know, like I was a doormat, basically. Just, you know, I wanted their like love and affection, and you know, if they, not that they would like physically or verbally abuse me, but they would just like kind of take me for granted, I felt like. So yeah, and I put up with it. I just put up with it, whatever. And now I feel like with the work that I've done, that I have like a very small little tolerance for that kind of shit.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I would be curious to know, because you kind of talked a little bit about you were looking at a bunch of self-development and tools and stuff. I'd be curious if there was any specific point or exercise or message that stuck with you to help push away from that kind of lower self-image model towards a higher one. And you can turn the question back around on me when you're done, but I've been trying to think of some exercises and stuff, but I haven't yet.
I think the thing that kind of turned it around for me, especially, I mean, it was a lot of things. I had done EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And that was like a type of therapy that made a big difference for me to get into a long-term relationship that I was in for almost 4 years. But I realized through landmark courses that there was even more layers underneath of all of that. And it kind of like stemmed from, you know, my relationship with my father and how I felt like not being a good enough daughter for him and being a disappointment of a daughter. And that was like a whole story and lie that I told myself, and that he didn't care. So I felt like, you know, my father didn't seem to take an interest in my life. These men don't seem to take an interest in my life. They're just like emotionally unavailable. I don't know how to develop that. And I guess the thing that got me out of that was realizing that just all of that was not true. It was a story an 8-year-old girl made up in her head about this time that when I was a kid that I didn't take this Chinese water painting class. I don't know if I've told this story. Have I? Maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know. If not, I'll just say it again, where I thought, because I didn't take this class that he wanted me to take, that made me a disappointment of daughter. And so I kind of withdrew from him and felt like I wasn't good enough and all of that. And that was why we don't have like a strong, close relationship. And what it took was like me being responsible for creating a connected relationship with him versus just being at the effect of however he is. That like, if that's something I want, I have to create it for myself. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I picked up 2 big themes, which I think it maps on really well to my experience. One is kind of getting a sense of agency or control around a lot of the events and relationships in my life. Like that helped me a lot as well. Like you were just saying, having seen some of the relationships and kind of blamed them externally or just thought like, well, that's how this person is, so that's how they're going to act to me. Like I can't do anything to change it, which is not, it's just a false belief of how things work. Right. The other thing that helped me a lot, and it sounded like you had some of the same pieces, is being able to break down some of these thoughts and find their roots a little bit better, right? So some of the instances where I felt low self-esteem, something would happen and then I would short circuit into the end of some other story, right? Something not completely related, but close enough where like, okay, someone is saying that, I'm not good at some sort of thing, right? Like a sport or something. There were stories that I've had in the past from myself that it was saying like, oh, I'm not good enough about this, like in this realm. So being able to see kind of the connections and some of the stories that I was short circuiting to, right? Like that really helped me get away from these kind of like very small things setting off and impacting my esteem negatively. It's basically the same thing that you said, but a little bit different. But those are 2 of the big things that I picked up on that also have been monumentally useful for me.
Great. Yeah. Do you have any examples from your own life or any exercises that you had implemented to kind of catch yourself or, realize that you were having some self-esteem low points?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's quite an exercise. I'll start talking about it and we'll see what it ends up as. But a big moment for me when I started, this sounds so silly, but when I started realizing that other people are all living out, their own lives in their own head, right? They are a person that has their own story and all their own things going on. And once I started being able to see like, okay, but this person did this to me, but what is their story? What are they operating out of? What is the point of these actions?
Right.
Once I started thinking that way a little bit more, I started opening up the possibility a lot more often of, instead of short circuiting to, oh, they don't like me, oh, they think I suck, oh, they think I'm a bad person, to all kinds of other things of like, oh, well, they didn't want to go to that event because they don't like watching sports, or they didn't want to do this thing because they were busy. They already had plans. It's not a reflection on me. So for me, and again, I don't know, it's quite an exercise, but starting to think that way, even though it's so simple, right? I should have known by the time I was a grown person that other people have their own thoughts and ideas and things that they need to do.
Doesn't necessarily involve you. Right.
But it took me a while. It took me a while to realize how true that was and to stop tying events from other people and to my own self-worth, especially since the majority of the time, the 2 were not related at all. And then on top of that, like I was saying before, I kind of also was able to develop a little bit better sense of, once I get those external comments or whatever that could potentially make me feel sensitive, just realizing that I have more control over whether I go, oh no, that person doesn't want to hang out with me, that makes me a bad person. Or if I just say like, they don't want to hang out with me, even if they think I'm a bad person, so what? That doesn't impact my worth or value. So that's one of the main things that helped me a lot, is to stop just going back to our other video, making assumptions. Like just stop making assumptions about what people thought of me. And then the other piece was building up some resilience towards, even if other people don't think I'm a good person,
Yeah.
then what happened? Like, as long as the people that I actually care about
Mm-hmm.
have the same sort of positive relationship towards me,
Right.
that's what matters. It doesn't matter if some random person doesn't like something I'm doing, or it doesn't matter even if the people that I care about think that I'm not good at a specific thing. They
Mm-hmm.
still like me, right? And when I flip the script around, and think about the people close to me in my life, and I think about, okay, if my sister
Mm-hmm.
wasn't good at writing a book, would I think that she has no value? No. So why would I let that judgment sit for myself? Like, that's a weird double standard
Yeah.
to judge myself differently than other people.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point that you made about, one, going back to the assumptions part, and that, people are going to think what they're going to think, and how you let that impact you makes the difference. It's like they don't have the full context of whatever's going on. And maybe they're thinking you did a bad thing because maybe they don't fully understand the issue, and maybe they're not open to understanding, or maybe they are. And whatever they are, it's like however they are. And it doesn't have to necessarily impact your value, because if you're confident with what you are capable of and your value, then it shouldn't matter what other people think.
Yeah. I also think that, at least in my experience, it's like 80-20 or more, in terms of 80% of the time those interpretations or assumptions are just so completely off base, right? In terms of me assuming that someone else
Mm-hmm.
thinks that I'm a bad person or whatever else, right? Like, the vast majority of times I've ever done that, I've been wrong. So eventually I realized that wasn't serving me especially well.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that's something that is somewhat common for people to see actions from others and then assume that there's some sort of value judgment and then internalize that judgment.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it made me think of a moment when I was back in my dating phase, of also thinking about how, before, like, when men would like dump me or ghost me, that would piss me off like
Yeah.
tomorrow, when I got ghosted, and it's just like me in my head spiraling about, like, what happened? What did I do? I don't know. Am I not pretty enough? Did I say something weird? Or like all of these thoughts. And then I would just be like spiraling about that. And then it just occurred to me one day where it's like, do I really want to be with someone who ghosts me? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
I don't. So why am I obsessively thinking about why he didn't call me back, or why he doesn't want to go out again? And when I just flipped that little thought process, and it's just like, it doesn't matter. None of that really matters. So yeah.
Yeah, that is something I am very familiar with and don't miss at all, which is the
Yeah.
slow spiral into insanity from being ghosted and just being like, what did I do? What? It makes such a big difference to just be able to catch those trains of thought as they occur and figure and see what the roots are, because a situation like that is so easy. It's so easy when you don't have enough information, and I think a lot of people have this built as the default, to spiral down into some sort of, well, it's my fault and I'm not good enough and I can't figure it out type of thing. Maybe that gets kind of close to an exercise, which is trying to catch those moments. If you happen to notice that you are having really negative self-talk, walk back through kind of what happened and see like the train of that thought. Because I think being able to identify those things makes it easier to see when the forks actually happen, and guide yourself towards a direction that doesn't end in low self-esteem and really negative self-talk.
Yeah. If only there was some device that, when that little negative voice in your head is talking at you, being like, oh, they don't like you, you're not good looking enough, or you're not smart enough. Just like an alarm would go off to be like, oh, there it is. You gotta stop it. Let's backtrack. Is this real? Or is this just
figure that out? That's a billion trillion
that would be amazing.
Yeah.
If only. but I get that. It's just like, it's gonna happen to everyone. And I think the thing that's important to know is that it's I don't think that little negative self-talk is ever going to go away, but you can train yourself to be like, okay, well, that's just, that little voice saying you're not good enough. And that doesn't mean anything, because in the reality of the situation is like, it's whatever it is. And
I do think that's one of the benefits of meditation or practices like that help you kind of train seeing your thoughts a little bit more clearly and more often, is you just happen to catch those things more. And that catching part is so important for being able to take action to kind of guide things in the right direction. That catching part is the difference between feeling down or having low self-esteem for 5 minutes or having it for 5 months. Like, it's such a
exactly, because you're stuck on that, like, believing that little thought is the reality of the situation, when it's not. It's just a thought that you had. And it's like, I think it is like training a muscle you have to exercise and catching it. And like, the more you do it, the more you exercise that muscle, then it's easier and you can get out of it a little quicker, versus being like, oh, there's a negative thought. That's just my brain sometimes. Move on. And
I mean, I would say from my experience, there was definitely in the past, before I started trying to consciously pay attention to some of this stuff, days where I would just sit on some little comment that didn't really mean that much and just play it over and over and over, especially like we were talking about in the dating realm, like some little interaction that I would just key off of for days and days at a time. And now I don't think that there's anything that can sit in my brain and bother me that much. I'm much more quick to accept and process things. Just like, wow, that thing that I said was super awkward. Okay. Like, so be it.
So what?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. And sometimes it helps if it's like a similar situation that happens, and then you get to be like, oh, this is what happened with my brain last time. I can change. Like, an example I thought of just now is when I've invited people to like a group event, and I sent like a group text or a group email or a Facebook invite, and then nobody RSVPs. I feel like then I make it mean like, oh, nobody likes me, nobody wants to talk to me, nobody wants to come to my thing, nobody cares, all of that in my brain. And I realize it's just like, people are bombarded with all sorts of invites all the time. And even I'm guilty. Like, I get emails and texts and invites and I don't always respond. I'm guilty of it. But even though I'm guilty of it, when it happens to me, I still am like, oh, they don't care. Nobody cares. Nobody's like, yeah. So I realized, to help me cope with that, or realizing that just people are busy and just because they didn't answer doesn't mean they don't care about you. I started to just, when it's like an important event, I'm more likely to individually like text people or call them, versus just like a group message. I feel like people in general don't respond typically to those, not usually. So I've just trained myself to know that this is how it is. And sometimes you have to message people individually. And even then they might not respond, but they're more likely to, at least.
Yeah. That reminded me of, in the past, I was trying to put some events together. Like, every once in a while, first of all, I hate planning events. I hate it a lot. But every once in a while, I would try to have, some get-togethers with friends and do some sort of thing. And people were responding, but every time everyone was responding no. And so that quickly got me, like, by the second or third time I tried to do, and this is spaced out relatively far, but the second or third time I tried to kind of put an event together, I was like, nobody wants to spend time with me. Like, I have my friend or two, but no one wants to come. Like, this sucks. These are people that I care about. These are people that I want to see. Right. Like, it really sucks that, like, it's not being reciprocated. It wasn't until I tried to put one event together, and then I talked to someone who hadn't come to any of the things. And this is, again, going to make me seem extremely naive, but the person was basically like, you are not giving anyone enough time to plan for these things. You're basically setting an event for the next day, and people already have stuff planned. People have stuff to do. Right. People aren't coming because they don't want to come. They're coming because they already have things planned, because there's a part of your process that's extremely broken. And it was a little bit of, like, that moment was a little bit of an eye-opening, like, wow, I spent all this time worried about like, oh no, nobody likes me, or like these people don't want to spend time with me. These are the people I care about.
Right.
When really like there was some other stupid thing that I was missing and not paying attention to. That was the real root cause.
Right.
That was one of the moments in my self-esteem journey that I was like, wow, I wasted so much time just building these stupid narratives when really I'm not good at planning events. It's not that people don't want to see me. It's that I'm not good at planning events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think we should evaluate the whole situation instead of jumping to the conclusion that they don't like us. Maybe consider there's other factors involved that may be why they're not responding, perhaps, or yeah. And I think it's sometimes not everything that could happen occurs to us. Sometimes I realize like something will happen and it just never occurred to me that, oh yeah, they have like a regular meeting at that time. So why should I invite them when I know they have something regularly scheduled at the time? So why should I be upset with them if they can't make it? Yeah. So
there's one more thing that I wanted to touch on, which is I think we've spent a good chunk of time talking about kind of the external to internal flow of like actions to self-esteem. I do think there are some cases, and I've been guilty of it as well, of feeling like low self-esteem. Not guilty. I've experienced this as well, feeling low self-esteem even when other people are trying to kind of bolster you, right? Like, oh, wow, I'm never going to be able to finish this project when everyone around me is saying that I can or that I should, but then still feeling like because I haven't finished it yet that I'm not a good person.
right.
And I think these internal thoughts, one of the ways to help beat those back a little bit is recognizing that just because the thought shows up doesn't mean we have to keep it and identify with it, right? Like you were saying, the negative self-talk will probably never go away, but one of the pieces of it is recognizing that thought and realizing that I don't have to say or stay with the idea that that thought brings, right? Just because my brain made it doesn't mean I need to keep it. I think that's one thing that we haven't quite touched on yet, because sometimes I've experienced negative self-talk completely independent of anything anyone else is doing. My brain is just making it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So from what I was hearing and what you were saying is that we are going to have all these negative self-talk that come, but it's just developing the skill to let it go and just like move past it, move through it, and be like, oh, there it is. there it goes. Yeah. Versus being just like stuck on it.
Yeah. And especially for me, at least, the piece that unlocked it a lot was not identifying with it. Right. So the difference between saying like, I'm not a good person, right? And then thinking, oh, I had that thought, so I must believe that about myself and that must be true about me, as opposed to I'm not a good person. And then going like, wow, my brain just made a thought that said I'm not a good person. I'm not going to keep that one, brain. Like I'm not down with this thought. I'm going to let this one go.
It doesn't line up with what I want for myself in my life. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. What about children, who maybe have not developed the skills yet to, when little kids are being mean to each other or saying like, you look stupid or you're a poopy face or whatever they say to each other. I don't know what kids are saying these days. They're like, how to not let that affect them.
I would not say that I'm the most experienced at this. So let's just put caveats, asterisks everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think it is about explaining some of these concepts that we've talked about already in a way that's digestible. And I think, I don't know, I would actually love to try this and get some more experience. But, things like trying to, I'm not sure what it looks like, but the conversation to try to convince, like an 8-year-old that a comment that someone else made doesn't necessarily need to have any impact on you. Right? That the way that you choose to digest that comment dictates how you're going to feel. I don't know how that conversation would go. I don't know how hard it would be to try to start putting some of these ideas into young minds.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we should bring on an expert guest for that kind of conversation, which we are planning to do at some point. Start bringing on guests to a show. So,
Well, I mean,
yeah.
I have the opportunity. I am home since we're all on
Oh
lockdown
yeah.
from the coronavirus. I do have young siblings.
Oh yeah. You could practice on them.
Yeah, who have experienced some
Mhm.
amount of bullying recently that I know about.
Yeah.
So I could try it, but yeah, I think that's what a big part of it is just trying to get that distinction. And I don't know the specifics for this, but the distinction between being valuable just because you're a person and people are valuable, and then kind of another piece is how you digest external comments and events, and knowing that your worth is actually separate from what anyone else can do. And then the last piece being, again, worth is not necessarily tied to achievement, right? Like you don't have to be good at basketball to be a good
Right.
person. You don't have to get an A on every single test to be a good person or to be enough, or all these other common phrases that it seems like people as they grow up can end up hanging on to and having negatively affect them. And I think probably getting those concepts as a baseline for kids, I would imagine would be easier. It's probably easier to convince them that their worth is independent of some of these other things because they don't have nearly as much history built up and all these other stories and all these other frames that we do as adults. But I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know completely either, because I don't have kids yet, but I am going to see my niece and nephew tomorrow, so maybe I'll try some things out on them. but what you just said though about kind of collapsing self-worth and value with like what you've achieved and accomplished, I think what stood out in my mind, I'm like, oh man, in Asian culture especially, just like that is totally collapsed all the time. It's just and it's not intentional, but it just felt like, you're about, if you don't get good grades, then you're bad, like you're a bad child. But in the same way, I could see like the benefit of that in that me trying to achieve a lot, going to med school, doing all these things, it's kind of pushed me to do a lot because maybe in some sense I was trying to prove myself to do whatever. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't have a super great way to prove this out. But I think, like you were saying, it could potentially be a source of motivation. But I believe very strongly that you could achieve the same sort of motivation or drive without using those techniques, right? You can share different ideas and values and get the same sorts of results. Clear, like, parallel to me is like a lot of people get worried that if they meditate a lot, they're going to lose their edge. And they're not going to have drive to do things because they're not going to be getting pushed ahead by whatever like crazy stuff they have going on. But everything that I've seen has shown that you just get more clear and calm, but you still achieve the same, right? You're still able to achieve maybe even more. And so in the same way, I think that there is an equally useful way, and I don't have the specifics off the top of my head, but an equally useful way to build esteem while keeping drive and showing kind of the value of achievement, right? There are things to be said for getting stuff done and having achievements and doing things. But I think tying your motivation to fear of losing your value as a person is not the ideal way to do it. I think there are other ways that you can maintain that, but still get people to move forward. I think the other problem that you run into is that you got a lot of that stuff done, right? You were able to accomplish many of those things.
Right.
So on the flip side, for someone who is pushed into things that they either do not want to do at all or don't have an aptitude for, they're going to end up with the same amount of achievement that they would have and no esteem, right? Because they're not, regardless of if someone is pushing them or not, if you don't have an aptitude or desire to do something, you're probably not going to do especially well.
Right.
So, and to give a more fair picture, I'm sure there are some instances where people accomplished a lot more than they would have because they had those two more tightly coupled. I just think that there's got to be some other third path, some other better way to get that done.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I absolutely believe it's possible to still be driven, motivated, without collapsing, like your value is tied to it. And ideally, I would prefer to have pushed myself because I knew I was capable of it. I had the confidence and self-esteem that I knew I could do it, versus being like a fear-based motivation because, oh, I'm not valuable and I'm not enough if I don't do this thing. And I feel like probably the results would be more better or feel more gratifying if it came from the, I know I can do this confidence mentality versus the fear mentality.
Yeah. I wish it was something that I had a better alternative for off the top of my head too, because I just have this very strong feeling that there almost definitely is something. I just can't think of what the other motivational trigger would be, right? And the other thing that I think probably would make some people nervous who are like more used to this tactic or approach is that what people produce may not be aligned with what their parents want if they're not using some sort of fear-based or like esteem-based thing, right? So to make that make a little bit more sense, if achievement and esteem are not closely tied together, and I say like, hey, as my kid, I want you to go be a doctor, and they're like, no, I don't want to. Like, if I have those decoupled, then what I have to say is like, okay, well, I support you for whatever choice you make. Like, I think you should do this, but I support you in whatever choice you want to make. However, that might lead to a path of like a very, very difficult career. But again, in the grand scheme of things, for me at least, happiness is like one of the highest values, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter to me, or wouldn't matter to me if I had a child that was not successful by any conventional means, like, but had the type of life that they wanted. Now, if they're working at, I don't know, something for minimum wage that they hate, and they also did not want to go to school and also did not want to do, like, if their life is bad and they have no measures of conventional success, that would be unfortunate. That would not be ideal.
I think it really boils down to like clear communication, and that if you're clear with your child that whatever they do, even if it's not, if maybe it's not going to be the most successful career, or it could be, potentially, if they want to be an artist, great, but it's tough for artists to make it in, what is it, like 1 or 2% like actually can successfully do it full time for their living. And so like the odds aren't in your favor, but if you were like, I will love you and support you, and it doesn't change how I feel about you, whatever career that you choose, but I just want you to be aware of like the risks, and I want you to like factor it in, and but it doesn't mean like take that corporate job. But like, if you really want to pursue your dreams, really like factor in, are you really going to push all in, or are you just kind of doing it as a side hustle or as a hobby? Like, are you willing to commit everything you got? And it still might not be prosperous at all, but if it gives you joy and happiness, that's going to be the thing that drives you, versus being like, I don't really want to do anything, so I'm just going to say this is the thing I want to do. Yeah.
I guess that's the difference, right? The difference is between basically wanting someone else to be cognizant of the full implications, right? Yeah. Like, as a parent, you have a better idea of how things will turn out on certain pathways, or the types of challenges that certain pathways tend to present. The other side of things, which I think is a lot more common, is kind of this like imposition of values in terms of, well, doctors are seen as successful. I think they're successful. That seems fancy to me. You should do that, without really getting into like the headspace of the other person and considering like, is this something that they would enjoy at all? Do they care if they have that much money, right? Like, maybe you want to be an artist and you're not that good and you barely make enough money to scrape by, but you don't mind living in a small apartment with a roommate. Why would I be able to say like, well, you shouldn't do that if that's what somebody wants to do? I think that's the difference, is like showing kind of the pathways or providing extra information, or just giving more context, or kind of like really pushing these values or ideas or paths externally without considering what the other person wants.
Yeah. They have to factor in that like even doctor seems prestigious and successful. Doctors have to pay a 6-figure student debt. Like, we are not rolling in it. So I'm just like, we have way more debt. So that's like, I don't know. I could have maybe been more successful as a plumber, like without accumulating such ridiculous student loans. So, you know, I personally, and I'm not trying to like put judgment on parents for whatever they do, but you know, I think when I do have kids and they're getting around the age of ready to go to college, I don't actually think that if they don't know what they want to do for college, that seems like a waste of money. If they're going to go in with an undeclared major, like they don't have a clear idea, I think it would be a better investment to go into like trade school. That would not cost as much, and you would be making a good income once you're done with a year or two of training that it would take. And that would be like, you know, people, there's nothing wrong with being a plumber. That's a very practical tool that everyone needs in every city. So skills, yeah. So, but it doesn't have like the prestige as a doctor. But I'm like, I don't know. When you don't have a 6-figure student loan, you gotta factor that in. Yeah.
So going all the way back to our original topic of esteem, I think that's what makes a big difference, is the way that that's kind of communicated, right? And in terms of separating out esteem from achievement, right? There's achievement for the sake of you wanting to do something, right? Like if you want to go to trade school and become a plumber, that should be weighted as a good enough achievement. Like there's nothing wrong about that, but I think sometimes the like parents or like the relationships get caught in these traps where it's like, I don't know that this achievement is good enough, right? Like that's something that people feel from parents all the time, where it's just it's like an imposition of values. And to me, that's such a easy way to put someone on a path towards lower esteem, is by saying like, here's my values, you need to follow them. And in fact, it's basically, even though not explicit, it's basically saying like, your love for me is dependent on achieving in this certain way. And that's a bad recipe.
No, I think I get what you're saying, that the two shouldn't be dependent on each other. It's clear that they should be separate components.
I guess what I was trying to get at for that specific piece is that two people's idea of achievement can be very different. So the things that I want to achieve, I might think, these are really cool, and this provides me enough value that gives me worth. But if someone else from the outside, like if you say, hey, this book that you've been writing is dumb, that's not what you should be working on. You should be working on this new, I don't know, computer project. I think that when that mismatch happens, that can cause lower esteem.
Yeah. No, I can agree with that.
That's all I've got.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.